Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. In this series, I speak to people who can help us to understand human decision-making and what we can do to mitigate the risks of it. As someone that normally does quite a lot of flying, I've always been intrigued by how the airline industry manages safety. After all, they've taken an activity that's theoretically quite dangerous, putting lots of people in a metal tube and then propelling it into the sky, into something that's incredibly safe. I'm always struck by that statistic that you're at greater risk driving to or from the airport than you are flying halfway across the world. Now, one of the most instantly recognizable aspects of airline safety is the safety card that, as they tell you in the briefing, you'll find in the seat pocket in front of you. You know, the one with the pictures that tell you how to do up your seatbelt, put on your life jacket, and how to find your nearest emergency exit. I find them fascinating, and I love the way they effortlessly combine artistic design with a high degree of functionality. Not only are they an amazing piece of compliance design, they're also a critical tool for mitigating human risk, which is why they're a regulatory requirement. If a plane doesn't have safety cards on board, then it's not allowed to take off. That's because one of the biggest risks when there's an incident on an aircraft is human. How we react makes all the difference. So if you were looking for something iconic that neatly summarized human risk and my mission to bring behavioral science to compliance, then the Airline Safety Card is probably it. If you've recently visited the Human Risk website, and let's face it, who doesn't go to human-risk.com on a daily basis, then you'll have noticed that the site is currently under renovation. Very soon, and maybe even by the time this podcast goes out, I'll be launching a new version, which is themed around, you guessed it, Airline Safety Cards. So to celebrate the launch of the all-new human-risk.com, I wanted to speak to someone that could help me to understand more about the safety card. How are they designed? What rules do they need to follow? And how do they decide what goes on them? Which is when I came across Trisha Ferguson. She's the CEO and owner of IRC, Interaction Research Company. Based in Olympia, Washington, IRC have been designing safety cards for the majority of the airline industry since 1971. Trisha has a fascinating story to tell about how she joined the company and went on to own it. So I thought I'd get her onto the podcast to share it with you. What you're about to hear are some fascinating insights about an item we all take for granted. So please enjoy my conversation with Trisha Ferguson on airline safety cards. So Trisha, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. I'm a little worried about you because I'm not sure you know what you've gotten into by inviting me, but I'm excited. I'm always up for an adventure.
Hey, listen, if this podcast is about nothing else, it's about human decision making. So I think I've got this right. You can try and prove me wrong. But to kind of kickstart us off, can you just tell my listeners a little bit about you and how you came to be in the position that you're in the moment?
I can. Well, I often say that, the world has a funny way of leading you down the right path. My name is Trisha Ferguson, and I own Interaction Research Corporation, and we are a company who provides aviation safety consulting. We produce passenger safety briefing cards for airlines all over the world. We've been doing it. We're celebrating technically our 50th year in 2021. And we've been doing airline safety cards and passenger safety briefing videos for, like I said, 50 years. We're excited about celebrating that upcoming. And we love what we do. We've been doing consulting and working with the global aviation industry for many, many years, and we love it. How I got into the industry is a kind of a crazy story. I'm sure we'll get into that. But
No, go for it. Perfect time to get into that.
Okay, so I'm also myself here in a couple of weeks celebrating 25 years of working for the company. And I've owned the company for the last 18 of those 25 years. And probably do a little bit of math here. You'll figure out that I'm younger than I look on this podcast. I was about 19 and I was in my sophomore year of university, as you say, in your end of the pond, and was studying communications at the time. and I was on a music scholarship, and wasn't quite sure what I was going to do for the rest of my life, which is a 19-year-old who does, right? And I was studying communications at the time and was doing music as a minor because I was being paid to be at university for that. And I ended up needing a part-time job. And so I applied for a job in the newspaper at the time. For some of your young listeners, if they could believe that I had a newspaper that was delivered to my parents' house at the and I looked in the want ads. Yeah. And I applied for a job at a company who was looking for a bookkeeper. And I walked through the doors and I sat down and drank my first cup of coffee, trying to look smart and trying to look professional. And the Wall Street Journal was in front of me that I had never read, but I was trying to look smarter than I was. And I sat down and I went in for the interview and had a really intriguing conversation with a company that was full of individuals who seemed really passionate about what they did. And I walked out not really being very clear, but I walked out thinking I really want to work at that organization because everybody there seemed really passionate. And I got a call a few days later and said, hey, would you come on board and would you be work in our office and do some bookkeeping for us part-time while you're in school? And I said, I'd love that. And I walked through the doors of this company. And I walked in, and within the first 3 weeks, I decided to change my major. And I fell in love with this company. I fell in love with the aviation industry. I immediately fell in love with the passion of what this company was about. And within the first 6 months of working here, I changed my major to international business and decided to really change my focus. And long story short, graduated with a degree in international business. Like I said, fell in love with really what the aviation industry represents. I think once you kind of get involved in this industry, it's really, really something that you either get planted in your heart. It gets planted in your heart and your soul, and it becomes a part of you. I fell really deeply in love with what this company represented, which was educating the passenger on how to protect their lives. And I was probably, I'm trying to remember how many years it was that I was working here. I don't know if I'm going too many stories into this, Christian, so please stop.
No, keep going. It's just fascinating. The passion is just screaming through. I love this.
There's so many stories to this place, but I had woken up one morning, and again, I had gone from the bookkeeper to being the business manager a couple of years into it. And it was 1999, and I had been here, I guess at that point I had been here, it was 1998, 1999. I'm trying to remember my dates. So I had been here 3, maybe 4 years at that time, and Ethiopian Airlines had a hijacking, and it had gone down as a ditching just off of an island, and it had broken apart. And that morning I had woken up, and there's actually some video footage of that particular crash that had happened. And many people survived that ditching and many people did not. And I woke up that morning to the morning news, and an individual was being interviewed on the morning news. And I was a business manager here at that particular time. And the person being interviewed, I woke up that morning, I was just getting ready for work, and the person being interviewed said, the reason I survived and the reason that I'm here today is because I picked up that safety card and I opened it up, and it told me not to inflate my life jacket until I actually was outside of the aircraft. And had I inflated my life jacket before I had gotten outside of the aircraft, I would have lost my life because it would have trapped me inside. And it was in that moment that I realized that what we were doing was not just important, but it was really the difference between life and death. and that it was making difference in the world. And it was in that moment when I went to work, and the individual that I worked for at the time was really the founder in many, many ways of the passenger safety briefing card. And I can talk much further about what he and his original partner did for this industry. And I looked at him and I said, someday you're going to want to retire. And I'd like to take this legacy on. And from that point on, after I graduated, I went on to pursue my degree in human factors and ergonomic psychology. And 3 years later, I took over ownership of Interaction Research Corporation. So that's kind of how that story all came about. So I say I accidentally fell into this on purpose.
That's amazing. And I just love that. I mean, and what a beautiful kind of a story about someone being able to follow their passion. And what an amazing story. And I definitely want to pick up some of the little bits there. But can you just talk a little bit about how the whole process works? So the reason I love airline safety cards is everybody understands what they are and understands what they're there for. But we kind of take it for granted. We sort of get on the plane and there's this thing in the seat pocket that gets referenced. And of course, for most of the time, we're not aware that it's there. Except when it's pointed out to us. And so what happens behind the scenes? How does all this work? The airlines approach you and commission you to design it? Do they come with their own designs? How does that whole process work?
So the passenger safety briefing card is really regulated. And it's regulated by the government in which the aircraft is certified. So each particular government that the aircraft flies or is certified under has a list of regulations in which the passenger safety briefing card must comply. So, for example, depending on which government compliance you are under, you will have a list of requirements that the safety card has to essentially meet and or exceed. And those really vary deeply depending upon which government you are kind of living under the umbrella of. So those are the places that most airlines start with. Now, you could be under the European governments or the Americas or Transport Canada, FAA, or anything like those particular organizations. Or you could have some pretty light organizations who are not as stringent. But you always start there. Those lists then are things that we keep on file that we're always aware of. The airlines will reach out to us. We have a standard of which we here are always meeting or exceeding, which go above the government regulations. So the airlines will reach out to us, or if we know of an airline that is starting up, or airlines that are making changes, or new regulations that are happening. I myself am a part of multiple different organizations, government and or safety organizations committees that I serve on. So I'm always constantly a part of kind of the aviation community's conversations, both nationally, internationally, globally. So I'm a part of kind of the conversations that are always happening. So I kind of know what's constantly changing and evolving and the conversations that are happening. So a lot of times it'll be people will either be recommended to us, airlines, or we are reaching out to airlines. So they come to us, we talk to them, it depends. But we start by having conversations about what's either people are getting new aircraft or they want to change their safety cards. They reach out to us, we design them for them. We pretty much know what they need to have on their cards because we're up to date with all of what they need based on their aircraft. But each aircraft, a lot of people, what they don't know is you can have an A320 or a 737 or any type of aircraft has multiple different types of equipment on it. So even though you have one type of airplane, it doesn't mean that they're all the same. That's one thing that many, many people don't know. A lot of times people will say, well, aren't they all the same? That's the question. That's the thing that I get all the time. People are like, well, how can you do that for a living? They're all the same, aren't they? And the truth is that there's so many different variables, different types of life jackets, different types of over water equipment, things like different types of floor path lighting. There's all different types of equipment.
And so this will come down to what the airline has purchased. So
correct.
They will have commissioned Boeing or whoever to make a plane this way with this many seats. And I'm thinking, I guess, particularly the obvious thing would be things like the sort of the further to the front of the plane you get, particularly on the long haul ones.
Yes.
There's going to be hugely different configurations around seats, and therefore that comes there. So exactly the same body will have a different piece inside of it, and therefore, to your point, you're not just changing the logo of the airline and the colors. You've actually fundamentally got to change the instructions that are on the card, because what you want people to do under configuration A may be different to what you need them to do under configuration B.
Correct. And there's different manufacturers of life jackets. There's different manufacturers of life rafts. There's different there's many, many different variables that go into. You might have some aircraft that carry cargo on board, and you might have different aircraft that carry cargo in the front, some that carry cargo in the back. I mean, there's all different types of variables that go into it. So an airline may reach out to us, and we take a look at their aircraft, and we design their safety cards for them based on where they're flying, based on what regulations they're flying underneath. We provide them with a proof that they take to their regulators. Their regulators must sign off on them. Once they've signed off, we will either produce them for them and ship those cards to their stores department, and they will send them to their team to distribute to their aircraft. Or we will license that artwork to them, and they will print them wherever they're at, and they will distribute them themselves. So depending on whatever fits the airline. But we do safety cards for privately owned aircraft. We do safety cards for government-owned aircraft. We do safety cards for really all sorts. You'd be surprised who we do safety cards for. We actually do safety cards for high-rise buildings. We do safety cards for all sorts of different kinds of, not just the aviation industry, but we do safety cards for other industries as well.
That's amazing. How much room for creativity is there in that space? Because as you say, you're getting a regulatory sign off, so they have particular concerns. But one of the things I find fascinating about, and I've read a few kind of airline regulations around it, because I think this is an example of a regulator that understands human dynamic.
Yeah.
So you've not got, because it would be perfectly possible to produce a theoretical airline safety card that told you what to do that would be utterly useless. Right, that would sort of just what I might impolitely call a kind of auditor's answer to it, right? Which is have a list of things they need to do. They can read this, and theoretically they'll know what to do. But what you've produced is something that's designed to be useful, that gets over the fact that there will be people that are unfamiliar with aircraft, people that fly a lot, people that speak. There's a language barriers. There's all those pieces. So it always struck me that it's an industry that's regulated by people that understand humans. And so how much room so presumably the rules are relatively enlightened in terms of understanding the fact that you do need to have something that's engaging, that's human, and therefore easily communicable. So how much room for creativity do you have within that? Or have they done most of the thinking around that, and therefore they're pretty prescriptive by the time they get?
So let me talk about, there's actually two ends of that spectrum, right, Christian? So the whole reason that Interaction Research Corporation really exists today is because Dr. Daniel Johnson and Dr. Bo Altman, back in the 60s, were working at Douglas Aircraft. And they were both human factors psychologist experts. They were working at Douglas Aircraft, and they were analyzing incident and accident reports for Douglas Aircraft. And what they realized is that all of the people that were injured and or dying in accidents, not all of them, I shouldn't say that, but there were so many people that were losing their lives because all of the responsibility was pushed up to the crew members in these accidents. Now there were safety cards. I'm doing air quotes on a podcast for people who can't see me visually. I'm such a physical talker. This is not working out well for me right now. But they were realizing there were safety cards that existed at the time, right? There was such a thing. But the problem is that they were almost all just written text. There was no visuals. If they were visuals, they were poor visuals. And so the information was not really given to the passengers to empower themselves. And so all of the liability and all of the responsibility was pushed to the crew members, which at that time, the crew members were not really trained. They were trained to really be more of a customer service kind of support system for the individual passenger, right? So the creativity wasn't there for education. The cards themselves were not creative enough to supply the information that was needed for the passengers to help themselves. So that's one end of the spectrum. So that's the whole reason that Interaction Research Corporation was born. These two individuals kept seeing all of this information. They went before Congress and said, hey, look, if we are going to put these airplanes in the skies, this is the type of product that must be mandated. We must require the airlines to put these products, the airline safety cards and the safety videos on board so the passengers can get themselves out of these situations should they arise. So these two men back in the 60s and 70s went before Congress and said this has to happen, right? So they went before Congress and they said, you have to do this. So they went before Congress, they got these products mandated. So they were mandated. And then they sat still working at Douglas. And then what happened was these airlines went back to him and said, okay, now what? Nobody knows how to do this. Right?
Great idea, guys. Help us out, right? Yeah.
And so then they were like, oh, shoot, how are we going to do this?
Right.
So they were in Long Beach at the time. And they're like, well, we better figure out somebody needs to do this. And so they started creating these in their garage while they were still working at Douglas Aircraft. And so that's how Interaction Research Corporation was born. And so then they started studying and creating. So our value has always been that everything that we do is tested. So every illustration that we create is sent out and tested for comprehension. We don't think that we understand it so that it makes it good, makes it comprehensive, right? It doesn't make it understandable. Somebody else has to because we stare at it every day. Just because we think it's creatively good doesn't mean it is good, right? That's that human factors side of it. But from the creativity piece, we can't go so far. We can't go so far into the creative side of it that it's so abstract. It has to be clear. It has to be concise. It can't be so abstract. We've had carriers come to us and say, well, we want to use these kinds of colors and we want to use neons and we want to use, well, you can't use those colors because those colors evoke a certain emotion. We all know from human factors, right? We all know that there's certain colors that evoke certain emotions. And once you feel those emotions, you stop perceiving information or you perceive information a certain way. So you have to account for all of those things. And those things, when we send them out for testing, will come back to us revealing information. So there is that fine line of when you're creating something to be comprehensive, you have to kind of ride that middle wave of not being just creative enough.
So this is literally going out clearly globally, I'm assuming, to make sure you capture different cultural nuances and understandings. And it's being put in front of people. And are they asked to describe what's there? Is this something you do yourselves? Do you get other people to do this? How does that testing happen?
So we actually have a company that they hire essentially, it's like a manpower. They hire, we don't pay for them directly. So they're not employees of ours, because from us, we wanted it to be a very clean They're not an employee. We're not giving them a paycheck from us. That way they don't feel like they're they're not responsible to give us a result. Our name is not on their paycheck. They get a paycheck from someone else. It's very clean. They test 50 people. We test 50 people. So we hire a company that hires people to do testing for us. And we've tested 50 people. And if it's not understood by more than 90%, it's each particular illustration and the illustrations in sequence. And we ask very clear questions about the sequences. And if they're not understood, we go back to the drawing board. We want to make sure that our cards are very clear, and that if we are trying to communicate, this is how you open a door, that they clearly know how to open the door, that if this is how you put the life jacket on, that they're very clearly know how to put their life jacket on. Because we're not just about selling a product to a client. We are very clearly about trying to save lives.
I've seen you've written elsewhere around some of the stories, and there was one that really struck me, which is when you talk about, when you tell people what you do and the sort of reaction that you get from people. And I'm assuming that, presumably when you're on a plane, you're going to be paying a little bit more attention to the card just because of who you are, and therefore presumably having conversations with people on planes. What kind of happens in those dynamics?
It's so funny because people, of course, I'm that person that's always observant of who picks up the cards around me, which is, I always feel somewhat responsible to lead the way with that, even though
right. You're judging them basically, quite rightly, right? And looking around going, so I'm going to set an example so they copy.
I am.
Right?
And of all people, I probably am of the last one that probably needs to pick up the card, just because I've seen a few in my day. But I always kind of observe how many people are picking up the cards, because, I do understand that there are some misconceptions about the card. I also do understand that many people don't really want to think about that particular aspect of their flight. But I do often strike up those conversations with people. What do you do for a living? And when that conversation comes up, it's almost inevitable that somebody's going to go, oh, these, and they pick up the card, and I thought they were all the same, and I'm surprised that's actually a career, and I never would have thought somebody actually made these. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Does that inform? I mean, so you've talked about testing in theory.
Yeah.
Is there any data that you get in practice? Because obviously, I can. There's one of the things I find really interesting about these things is it's a little bit like a sort of fire drill, right? We can rehearse things, and until we've been through it. And I had a really interesting. So I went on British Airways allows people to go on their safety training.
Yes.
This is a few years ago. And I'm like, I am so up for this because I was doing so much flying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I really, statistically, I ought to be going on this thing. And I'm fascinated by the process.
Yeah.
So I went on this thing and sat in the cabin and it was filled with smoke.
Yes.
That's a fundamentally different experience to sitting back, knocking down a couple of gin and tonics and relaxing.
Yeah.
And so that stress situation is kind of is an interesting one. Is that something that's looked at all as well, about how those things work in stress situations?
I think it's always surprising how people respond in stress situations, right? We've always heard about fight or flight. How did you respond in that situation? How did you feel about being in that environment? Did you surprise yourself?
I knew it was coming,
right?
Because obviously they
so it's not really a true response.
So it was really interesting, and even then, it was kind of like, whoa! I was shocked at the sort of the speed with which it came. So I kind of recognized that even with a little bit of preparation, I still wasn't as ready as I thought I was going to be. And I think it was that classic, I'm going to and I now know, having been on that course, I'm like, if this happens, right, I'm going to be better prepared, idiot. But I'm still going to be in that kind of, the health thing. And I think it's really interesting. And this is why the subject fascinates me, is I think that we all have this vision of how we think we are going to behave.
Right.
And then reality strikes, and it's sort of, we can do all sorts of things. And that's why I'm fascinated by this piece, because what you're creating is something that is designed for This isn't designed for sort of positive. This is designed for a really serious situation.
Yes.
And you need to know what to do. And we have to get through to you at a point when you might not necessarily be receptive to common sense or normal methods of communication.
You know what's really interesting? I have pages and pages and pages and pages. I can't tell you. I mean, it's shocking how much information and reports I have and interviews of people who have been in very, very serious accidents and reports, and been a part of interviews of people who have been sole survivors or been some of very few survivors of major, major accidents over decades of accidents on airplanes. And it has all been pretty much the same. I don't know that response is the word I'm looking for, but the same shared story and experience. And certainly one of the most recent, at least in the US, which I think a lot of this is very public information, you could probably find it online too, is the miracle on the Hudson. This was, and this was
the Sully story.
Yes, and this was where there was many, I mean, obviously everyone survived. So there was a lot of shared experience. Is the level of calm in a very, very not calm situation. And the level of calm in a panic situation that people actually feel shockingly in airplane accidents. That you don't find, there isn't the stereotypical movie response, is the general response that historically that you read, and that these interviews of people, the reports that have over decades, it's almost the same similar report. It's really, really interesting that there really isn't a lot of time to behave that way, and your body doesn't really give you that response. It's interesting. So it's interesting. I can't really speak to why that is. I mean, I can't really speak to why that is, but
I guess it doesn't really matter, right?
No.
It's sort of it's this shared experience. And one of the things I think is interesting is the difference between a theoretical solution to a problem and the practical realities of human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So what I think you're dealing with here, and where some of my questions and thinking has been going, is really to sort of say, judging whether a safety card is successful based on my perception. I'll get on a plane, I go, what is this thing? The critical test here is, does it help people in those emergency situations? And of course, you're designing it around the way people actually behave.
Right.
As opposed to the way that we would theoretically like them or presume they behave.
Right.
And I think this is why I think this is a fascinating study, because you have to be attuned to that piece, because that's what's driving the regulation. That's what's driving your clients' demand. Because this is an interesting example of a regulatory requirement where regulator and regulatee are 100% aligned. You get a lot of industries where the regulator is stopping something from happening.
Yes.
That if the industry participant had their own way, banking would be a really good example, right? They would be doing all kinds of stuff.
Right.
In this case, it is not in any airline's interest whatsoever to have any fatalities or injuries from anyone that's ever on their aircraft. And nor is it in the regulator's interest. So there's this beautiful coalition of things that means, I think, that you've got something here that you can focus on that says, actually, well, let's go for the best outcome here, as opposed to, because it's not in the airline's interest to try and arbitrage the rule and go, let's do something that's a little bit racier because it doesn't matter.
Right.
Because actually it does matter, and you know why it matters. So I find this fascinating. So studying actually what people do in that situation doesn't become a game of arbitraging the rules or trying to cut corners. It's genuinely everybody's trying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And this is why I think it's a really fascinating subject, because as you say, you can start to look at what do people really do and how can we influence those behaviors in reality, as opposed to looking like we're ticking a box?
Yes, I think the biggest obstacle I think that you butt up against in these type of situations, which I think is common in many other industries when you're trying to communicate any amount of information, is that kind of funnel situation where you've got a lot of information to communicate. But when you've got a lot of information to communicate and you have an audience of people who are really, for the most part, only used to consuming information in either small amounts or they only have a certain amount of time, you have to really pick and choose what is the most important information to communicate and how to do that effectively. So you can't communicate, especially on an aircraft, you can't communicate everything that you need to communicate to a passenger on board that aircraft, right? So some of the obstacles that you run into is you can't illustrate every single piece of that door operation, right?
Right, because otherwise you'd have it'd be a fat book.
Oh my gosh.
Go to page 567 as people are, it's just unrealistic. I wouldn't fit in the seat either, but that's a secondary consideration.
Let's get the engineering drawings from Airbus, right? No, right. I mean, you can't. Right. So you have to get the engineering drawings from Airbus and you have to get that funnel and you have to take it down to, here is a lever on something that looks close enough like that door operation so that the human eye can have that visual association to simplify it so that it becomes something clear. I posted on our Instagram, or maybe our social media manager is going to do this soon. Sorry, it's above my pay grade. Sorry.
I love it. So your business is communication. So there's got to be a lot of pressure to be your social media manager, right? Because your whole business is about effectively communicating in short bursts with an audience. And what is social media if not the same thing? So I'm like, you should have stellar social media.
Shockingly, we have just started. I'm embarrassed to say we have just started some social media, but as far as with our aviation side of things, but we were talking about our life vest illustration. And you would think that would be like just the simplest of illustrations. It should be something that a company like ours should be able to illustrate in 5 minutes, which at this point in the game,
there's a stock image. I mean, off the top of my head, I'd be going, sure, there must be a stock image because you've done this before, right? How hard can it be?
And the truth is there probably is a stock image. That is something that, we worked on 50 years ago, but it's something that took us 50 years ago, weeks and weeks and weeks to figure out the right stock image. Does that make sense? To really get right so that you took all of the bits and pieces out so that it looked like an aviation stock image, or like an aviation life vest. Because that's the thing is whenever I say to anybody who's outside of kind of what we do, they'll say, well, doesn't a life vest just look like a maritime life vest? Well, no, it doesn't. And in fact, we were doing some certification testing here because we do some projects like that. There was a manufacturer of life jackets and they needed to get them certified with the FAA before they could start selling them to different global airlines. And so we were doing a certification test study for them. And so we had 100 participants coming in, donning the life jacket in a certain amount of seconds. And we were filming them to see if they were, if they could do it to get it certified. And they don't work the same way as water life jackets, maritime life jackets. And people don't know that because they think one life jacket is like another life jacket. And so it's interesting. So it's you think life jacket, you think it's simple. And so it's funny because
right.
we think life jacket should be something simple, and yet it would take us.
Well, I found myself nodding as you were saying it, right, and laughing at these idiots, and then realizing
we are the idiots, Christian.
I definitely am the
No,
idiot
wait,
because
we
I had assumed it would be a standardized. So I sort of I was shocked earlier when you said it's a different product between planes, because I can get the fact that a boat might have different things to on a plane because you're storing in a different place and there's different conditions under. So I can sort of understand that, but it's interesting that there's lots of different, and I guess you want competition in that space for innovation purposes. So it sort of makes sense. But you're right, it's not something we tend to think about, and yet from your perspective, when it really matters. You got to get people to get this right. Engaging in and this is an interesting bit as well for me, it's engaging in an activity that they have probably never experienced before. There's lots of times where we get told what to do in situations that we're familiar with. So I will, I like fire escapes where we practice these things, or maybe it's kind of instruction manuals for how to operate certain pieces of equipment where it's kind of a repeat thing and you do it. You expect to do it lots of times. What's interesting here is that you're teaching them something that, one, they don't ever hope to have to do. And the second thing is it's the likelihood of them experiencing it lots of times is pretty marginal, which I guess leads to a switching off. But also it means you have to be super clear to somebody that is uninitiated in the practice.
Yes. And that goes back to, part of what I was saying too is about that we get so I don't know if immune is the right word, but we get to these thoughts that we have that might not be accurate, which are that every aircraft is the same and every life jacket is the same and every seatbelt is the same which is just not true. So a lot of people think, well, I'm a business traveler. I've flown 800 times. Well, but you may have been on 62 different aircraft that have 62 different ways of opening the door to get out.
Right.
And of those 62 aircraft, they may have had, 8 different types of life jackets, and they may have had, 6 to 10 different types of life rafts. And they may have, just all those variables that go into, should you, heaven forbid, have a ditching or need to get out, have an egress situation. There's just so many variables that go into how to really protect yourself, and the best way to get out of an aircraft is to help yourself.
Right, not to rely on other people for obvious reasons.
And one of the biggest things that I think people may not think about is that we have, repeat patterns and repeat behavior. So in situations such as incidents or accidents, our first reaction is to go out the door we came in. That's going to be one of our first responses. It's going to be on board the aircraft. It's going to be everybody on board. It's going to be one of our gut reactions, our first initial reactions. Everybody's going to want to go out that one aircraft, that one door. So if you can just get that one thing right.
Yeah. No, it's logical, right? It's like, I'll go out the way I came in, right? Why wouldn't you? It's what we do in most rooms. That's what happens. Yeah. So logically, exactly. And you talked there about the life jacket situation and some of the broader pieces that you're involved with. And so you're presumably consulting on a range of these aspects, not just the card itself. That's the sort of bit that we might see. But there are other aspects of this piece of yours as well. You mentioned safety briefings.
Correct. Yeah, we're kind of a unique company in that regard. We're a company that really is involved in aviation safety as a whole. And it makes us quite different than some of our there aren't very many companies who produce passenger safety briefing cards really in the world, truthfully, but there are not any other companies like ours who are involved in the aviation safety realm like we are. I was mentored by, some of the greats who were involved with passenger safety, aviation passenger safety, and I've hopefully taken up that mantle well, and I'm super passionate about it and love it, and will continue to do it for many decades to come, hopefully.
Presumably, there's a whole load of innovation that one could move towards. So I can see, on the one hand, you'd say the card is quite a primitive technology, but it's also very durable. It sits there. It's not gonna. If you have a power cut, you don't. So there's a lot of reasons why you would go for what you might term a sort of old school approach to it. But equally, there's lots of interesting things that we've seen with regard to airline safety where, for example, if I think about the nature of briefings, so you've got a lot of innovation in that space, whether that's using cartoons or things to kind of get us to engage, or you've got some airlines that give their crew a little bit of latitude around how you present it, showing it. So it's been quite interesting to watch, certainly over my lifetime, quite a lot of innovation in that space as well. Is that sort of ongoing? Are we, interesting ideas coming in that space?
Yeah, certainly the video side of it it's night and day. I mean, our company created the very first passenger safety video back in the 70s. And it is in a vault in our warehouse because there is this whole underground collectors community that I think if they could get their hands on that would be right now they're drooling. I promise you.
Right.
It is primitive to say the least. It was created way before I was born, but it was, very primitive, done well for its time, but it is, on a big reel. It's old school. It's old school. And it has come a long way. And there have been many, many things done in the last 50 years to really try and just draw some attention to the concept of safety. And I love that. And I'm so appreciative of it. I'm just thrilled. As far as the passenger safety briefing card, I think it will have a place for many decades to come, again, because of that power issue. I think there may be some interactive things at some point that come forth. I don't know that that's something that the airlines will really want to move towards. It's a touchy subject because it's, the airlines themselves value safety so much, but it's also a touchy thing to market.
Right. Yeah, because you're effectively reminding people of the potential risks of an activity they're about to undertake. And I guess, it's exactly what I was thinking is that if you really wanted people to retain the information, you would kind of find some way of testing
Correct.
that or kind of and therefore you could have something, I don't know, where if you've got screens in the back of the seats, you could do a kind of which one of the, but would that pass the kind of passenger acceptability test? And you you possibly don't want to be the first airline trying that out because that might be something that could be at the margins, could be something people go, I'm not going to engage with this, and actually get so irritated that they're not paying attention to the rest of the stuff.
We've talked a lot about it. I think it's just a difficult subject because there is the reality and then there's the perception. The reality is that flying is one of the safest things that you can do transportation wise. It is so, it's such a safe way of traveling. Statistically, it's phenomenally safe.
Well, there's that amazing stat, isn't there? That you're at much greater risk driving to the airport.
Oh, for sure.
Than you are on the plane.
This was probably 20 some years ago, but there was some statistic that used to say that you would have to fly every single day for something like 5,286 days in a row just to be involved in like a hiccup incident. Which mean, you know what I mean? And that was the statistic. This was 20 some odd years ago. It's like infinitely more safe today than it even was 20 some odd years ago. So, the statistics are incredible at how safe it is, but the perception and the emotions of how it feels, because it's not something that people do and are numb to, it's not something that a lot of people do every day. There's the perception of how it feels. It's foreign. It's not as normal to a lot of people. So there is that, how do we get people this information and make it feel normal, just like getting people information about how to be safe in their car. And that feels a lot less offensive to the spirit than how to be safe in an airplane, if that makes sense. So that's kind of that push-pull of, you want to draw attention to that passenger safety information, but you don't want to make people feel fear. So it's tough.
Right.
It's tough.
And it's a fascinating balancing act. So you've you've gone from here's a theoretical list of things you should do through to let's make this practical and engaging and people can use it. It's actually usable. Then you add that psychological layer of maybe this is information I don't want. So even if I know that it's useful to me and logically I ought to want to see it, emotionally I don't want to engage with that stuff. So you're designing something that sits in that beautiful sweet spot of we have to make it practical and useful and human. On the other hand, we can't take that to the logical extremities because this isn't it's not designed for sort of ultimate clarity and usability piece because actually we've got that emotional layer on top that wouldn't let you take it to that logical extremity. So I find it fascinating that in a way, you really have to balance this between if you were designing a pleasurable product, right? It's a fun thing to use where the net result of paying attention to it was you got joy. Mm-hmm. Then you'd be in a different space to the one which is kind of like it's a negative. So I think this is a really delicate balancing act that you're running here, which sort of has to recognize the way humans operate in the wild, but also recognize the way humans who are being told how they need to operate in the wild when they're not in the wild should react. So it's a real sort of series of behavioral lenses that you need to look through. And that's one hell of a challenge.
It is. And what's interesting is that there is this backwards reality, there is this upside down between emotion and reality. There was a statistic, and again, this was years ago, but I think it's been in the last decade, that 9 out of 10 people, when asked, their perception was that over 90% of people believed that they would not survive an accident. That there was that if you ask people, 90% of people would say, if I was in a plane crash, I would die. Like there was no way that you would survive it. And the truth is that over 90% of accidents are survivable. If you know what I mean? So there is this like weird, their perception of reality is almost exactly the opposite of reality.
Right. So we're really bad at assessing risk. And therefore, to your point, I don't need to read this stuff, right? Because if this happens,
I need to read it?
This is useless information to me because it won't make any difference, right?
Which is the exact opposite of the truth.
And you can't, of course, tell people that because that would mess with so, because you then end up with a reactance around, you're just telling me that. You're just trying to a little this. I mean, this takes us into really interesting sort of political things where that is kind of fake news.
But it's 100% of what I was just thinking, and I was like, do I go there with my British friend? It is exactly conspiracy theory central. The only reason they're telling this stuff is to lull us into a false sense of security because this thing's really, which is not the point at all. But it's fascinating, really. I didn't think we were going to get to this point, but logically we have, and I think it's fascinating. This is not fake news, people. This is not fake news.
Right.
Yes. Your survivability of an aviation incident and accident, it really is a direct result of education. It really is. Statistically, it really is.
Insane. So, wow. And there's a couple of other things as we're running out of time. I can keep going down because this is fascinating. One other question I want to pick up, and you alluded to it earlier when you were talking about call them collectors. So there is a bunch of people out there, and I found this fascinating as I was researching this stuff and looking at the whole. I found it fascinating. There are people out there that collect these things. And so first point is, do not do this, people. Don't take them off planes. They're there for a reason. Ditto life jackets. Don't take those as souvenirs. But there are people that collect these cards. I wonder what you thought about that. Because from a rational business, I could have a sort of extreme business mind that would go, this is good. Demand for the product, right? Airlines have to buy more of them. From a practical perspective, that's not great. But I'm fascinated what you think about that. Do they approach you directly? How does this collector thing come about? What's your perception of it?
Well, first of all, I understand the passion and the love for the aviation industry. Like I really, it's one of those industries that if you think about it, has really changed our world. It's changed our world. And to think about people who had dreams, think about entrepreneurs who had dreams and inventors that had dreams and put their dreams on paper and put those papers into plans and put those plans into reality and put those realities into creating new commerce and commerce into new, it just changed our world.
Right.
So I totally understand the passion, and I understand the love for the industry. So I totally get it. I totally get it. And many of the collectors are people who have worked in the industry, people who are involved in the industry. And I understand the love for particular airlines that meant something to you, the Pan Ams and the Easterns and the TWAs and the World Airways and all of those, companies that were with the British Airways. And so I get it. I love the collectors. I really do, because they are passionate about what I'm passionate about, which is the safety cards. I really do. This last summer, in this season of kind of COVID, just shifting things and things kind of being in somewhat of a lull, we decided to get some new equipment and change some things around here, just as we're kind of taking a moment and having some time to breathe. And so we started clearing some things out of our warehouse, and we started going through like 50 years of overs and samples that we have in our warehouse. And I thought, I should maybe see if some of these collectors want some of this stuff. And I had one of my team members just put some, pull some of this stuff, because we've got, again, thousands and thousands and thousands of cards in our warehouse from 50 years that we've been holding on to. I'm not 100% sure why, Christian, because they mean something to us.
Because human, we love hoarding stuff, right? And this is, okay, it would be weird if you could just chuck them out, right? Because that would show zero interest in the product.
And I think, again, most of this stuff was here before me, truthfully, and it's moved with us 3 or 4 times as we've expanded, and I don't know why. And so we kind of put these boxes of 100 cards together, and I thought, we'll just put a few on eBay or something and see if some of these people want some. Right. Which was an interesting venture, and I was shocked at how many people wanted them. And so we let go of some of them on eBay, and we have quite a few more. And I think we are going to probably set together some sort of what we refer to as collector boxes that we will distribute every quarter, and maybe make it a little bit easier for them to get their hands on some older cards, and then maybe distribute what we print every quarter for these people who love what we do. And essentially not like the razor, get your razor every quarter, or get your, get your safety card every quarter. Right. And I'm not I have told some of these collectors this, and I've promised them that we're going to launch it, and I promised them that we will get to it, but probably won't be until 2021 in our 50th year, and every quarter get them some of the cards that they love.
But that's a beautiful kind of unforeseen business opportunity.
It is interesting, Christian. Now, I don't think we're going to replace the airlines with our collectors. No, I love them, and I love that they share the passion. And truth is, we just needed some more space in our warehouse for what we're going to do in the future for the airlines and stuff. But I am excited because honestly, for years, I have appreciated that they have shared the passions, right? But I haven't been able to figure out how to, I can't take away from my production team's time to pull, 2 or 3 cards for every collector that wants to have me mail them some cards, right? So I was trying to figure out a way that we could meet the demand. So I don't think that we'll make millions off of collectors, but we can certainly now. I have tried to fight. I did have some brain space in COVID, I'll say that, to figure out how to meet their passions and meet the demand by maybe doing something like this. And maybe it'll be successful enough for it to pay for itself to meet that demand. And that'll be great. And if it does, awesome. And if it doesn't, then maybe it'll only be something we do for this next year. Looking
at your client base, there was a lovely blog that you wrote, which I'll put in links to the show notes, because I thought it was It was really just sort of from the heart, and it demonstrated, I think, your proximity to the industry you serve. And I think the story that you've then told, on this podcast around how the business came about and your interest in it sat very authentically next to that, which is you said that you'd been calling your customers not to try and drum up more business, which is sort of, I thought it was a lovely thing, because I can imagine the last thing they would want to hear from is somebody going, can we sell you some more stuff, at a point at which their business has literally kind of, been severely hit. But I thought it was a lovely thing. And I'm fascinated how you are a derivative, supplier to an industry that's gone through an interesting challenge. And you actually mentioned that in your blog that your I think it was the time you bought the company was just before 9/11. So you've seen some major pieces, which I guess is clearly a driver for your product, but you have to be very cognizant of it. How have you found, both the 9/11 piece and now, how's that been like, servicing an industry that itself going through some really challenging times?
I will say, first of all, I think being an entrepreneur is never an easy thing. I think it's one of the biggest gifts to be able to do it. And I don't take it for granted. And I'm so grateful to have the opportunity. And I was really young when I was given the opportunity to do it. And I am grateful that there was an individual who, especially as a young woman in the aviation industry in the 90s, it was very foreign. And especially an entrepreneur in the 90s, or as a potential in the 90s. When I entered into the room in 1995, I was 19, and my previous employer, the owner, really took some risks in inviting a young woman into the room back in the 90s, truthfully, because it wasn't really an environment where that was common. And so I really am grateful for him to do that. And as a young woman, when I took ownership, I signed that purchase and sale just before 9/11. And I was really young. And I'm grateful to have done that. And I'm grateful to have walked through that season. The beautiful part about 9/11, we'll talk about the beauty of it first. The beautiful part about 9/11 is I really felt like that shifted the passenger in many ways. It shifted the passenger in many ways in the sense that it, I think, made the passenger more aware of their responsibility for their safety. It was a situation where passengers really started to notice that they had an influence in how they could act and react in an emergency situations on board an aircraft. And so I really sensed and saw a shift in how people carried themselves and observed inside airports, inside airplanes. They kind of perceived safety as a much more important thing. So I saw a real shift in the passenger in addition to a shift in the industry. So that I really appreciated about 9/11. It was hard, I think, on the industry because it changed a lot of the little guys. A lot of little guys were lost. A lot of them were swallowed up, and it changed kind of how the industry, a lot of small companies, a lot of small airlines were absolved into larger carriers. So that changed a lot. But, it slowly rebuilt. COVID has been really difficult, I think, emotionally on the staffs and teams inside the carriers. I really love the people. I really love this industry. And if there was ever a moment when I was not calling to drum up business, it was in April of this last year. There was no business to drum up. There was no business to obtain. So my phone calls was about me caring for people that I care about. and me saying, what do you need? How can I help? What, I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. We're in this together, because the truth is we all are in it together. This is an industry that has a long history of, no pun intended, this is a bad dad joke, but a lot of ups and downs. That's just the truth of this industry. But the industry always comes out on the other side. And we always come out better, and big lessons learned, and it will come out on the other side. So right now, there's just a lot of transition of people. And so it's really about, the teams and how the teams are going to come out on the other side. So that is really the big part of this piece, that I think for the people who are in it, it is all about their brothers and sisters in their offices and how they're doing. So that's the big piece in COVID, and how everybody's doing emotionally. Yeah, that's been the toughest part.
Wow, that was so beautiful and heartfelt, and thank you for that, because I think that really that's how the blog came across when I originally read it, and it was just that was a lovely exposition. To finish us off on a lighter note, because I do want to make sure that we close out with the question I want to ask. So when we're flying again, and let's go with this when, and hopefully sooner rather than later, because I am missing it big time. When I'm sat there on my carrier of choice, and I pull the card out, how will I know that it's one of your cards? Is there any little marks we should look for?
So on the back of the card, you will see there is a copyright symbol. And on the back, you will see a copyright symbol that says Interaction Research Corporation. Yes.
So that's what we need. That's what we need to look out for. So there's a good reason, if nothing else, if you don't feel this, you should now, having listened to this podcast, there's a good reason to go looking at the card. Yes. So we can check out if it's
there
one of yours.
There are a few carriers that we do some consulting with that copyright their own cards. So we may have some input in their cards, or we do some consulting with them and they copyright them themselves. But most of our cards are copyrighted, and our name is on the back, and it says Interaction Research Corporation or safetycards.com.
Amazing. That'll give people something to focus on, and then look at the rest of the card. Obviously, pay attention because it's important. Listen, thank you so much, because it's been really enlightening. It's been entertaining. It's been just above all an absolute pleasure. I've learned so much from you. I can really feel the passion coming through, and I love talking to people that are passionate about what they do. You have to be passionate to do what you do, because you wouldn't have gone through that journey. And all of that came screaming through. So thank you for educating me and my listeners, for entertaining us and giving us some tremendous insights that I think actually have a huge amount of relevance for most of my listeners in whatever field they're in, because a lot of things you were talking about, the human components, both in the way you run your business, but also in the product that you're delivering, I think is relevant to other people. And if we had more of that, if there's one hope I have, is that COVID drives a lot more of that thinking. It would be for people to think in those terms. So thank you for being inspirational and informative and entertaining.
Christian, thank you so much for having me. It has been an absolute great day, and I'm just so thrilled to be here.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Trisha for appearing, and to you for listening. To find out more about IRC and to read Trisha's blog, have a look in the show notes. There are links to both there. Also in the show notes is a link to human-risk.com, my website. If the new Airline Safety Card inspired version isn't out yet, do check back. It's coming very soon. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the platforms. I'll be back very soon with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. But in the meantime, please stay safe, and thanks for listening.